Hi everyone, it's Liz here. I'm just going to talk through the lesson sequencing activity that you've been set for this week. Now this is an example for a Year 8 maths class working on calculating percentages. So primary and secondary students this week have been set a very similar task. So I'm just going to talk through this Year 8 maths one as an example. So yeah, we're looking at how to solve problems that involve the use of percentages. That's my curriculum descriptor that this lesson sequence is based on. In the assessment task, students will be demonstrating a number of different knowledge and skills related to calculating the area. They need to calculate the area of parts of this pyramid, but then they need to calculate the percentage that each section represents. And so that's why in this sequence of lessons, I'm going to focus on teaching students to solve problems that involve the use of percentages. So my next step is to develop some CUDs. So things that students need to know, understand, and to be able to do to meet that particular curriculum descriptor. So you can imagine if I'm teaching students about calculating percentages, they'd need to know some vocabulary, things around proportion, percent, decimal, place value. They'd have some understandings, for example, that quantities that are in proportion can be increased or decreased in proportion. And some skills, things that they'd need to be able to do, for example, converting decimals to fractions and percentages. So you can do the same thing with your context around money and financial literacy. You've got the curriculum descriptors there. You need to think, well, what kinds of CUDs are related to those curriculum descriptors? Once you've come up with some CUDs, you then need to use those to inform your lesson. So you're going to plan between 3 and 5 30-minute lessons. So in my example here, in the first lesson, I'm going to teach students about proportions. So you can see the learning objective. So I'll start this lesson by revising proportionality, recapping the language that we need. So 2 per 5 means 2 for each 5. We'll go over a strategy for calculating proportions. After we've done that, I'm then going to extend students into thinking about percent. So I'll revise that percent means per centum or per hundred. And we'll practice finding an unknown amount. So we'll teach them a strategy based on their knowledge that they have about proportions and some knowledge about multiplication to calculate an unknown amount. So you can see already across those first two parts of this lesson how they are logically sequenced. I wouldn't start by teaching students percent and then go back and talk about revising per. So, already we're seeing a logical progression of ideas, and it also builds in complexity. So that will probably take me a whole lesson. I'll do a formative assessment in the form of an exit slip. I'll have some leveled questions that relate to what we've covered in the lesson. And I'll also include a challenge question where I'm asking students to find an unknown percentage. So in this lesson, they were finding an unknown amount, but in the next lesson, we're going to look at finding an unknown percentage. So I'll just include that question there to see if any students already know how to do that, can work it out if they think about it a little bit. That'll just give me a little bit of information in conjunction with those other questions about whether or not we're ready to move on. So when I come to lesson 2, we'll start with a recap, a warm-up. We'll look at what we did in the last lesson, work through a problem where students need to find the unknown amount. And so how long we spend on that recap will depend on what I found through my analysis of data from that formative assessment task. So, if students demonstrated that they weren't quite understanding how to calculate an unknown amount, perhaps I'll do some small group work to consolidate that knowledge. Once I'm confident that my students are ready to move on, I'm going to move into finding an unknown percentage, and I'll teach them explicitly how to do that. Then I'm going to move on to decimals, and we'll start by thinking about where in the world around us do we see and use decimals. And then we'll move on to representing percent as fraction and decimal, and we'll use a hundreds grid to do that. So, we'll learn that 37% can be represented as 37 out of 100, and it can also be represented as a decimal number, 0.37. So that will be our lesson. Again, you can see the complexity that's building, how it's a logical progression of ideas. My formative assessment for this lesson will be a math maze where students have to apply that knowledge of converting percents, fractions and decimals to complete the maze. And I'm going to make a link to the next lesson by just previewing changing the unit from ones to hundreds, because that's what we need to do. That's our next step towards being able to calculate percentages. So I've included a fair amount of detail in these two lessons as an example. You don't necessarily need to include quite so much detail. I just wanted to sort of demonstrate to you the thinking in how these lessons are logically sequenced and how they build in complexity. Just keep the purpose of this task in mind. The purpose is for you to practice sequencing lessons in a way that is logical, builds complexity, and that you're including opportunities to check students' progress.